Thank you very much, Dr. Parkin. We'll now welcome Dr. Larry Bramlage to the stage, surgeon and partner at Rood and Riddle Equine Hospital, to present on building a 2-year-old skeleton for racing. This is a continuation from 2 previous presentations by Dr. Bramlage at the Welfare and Safety of the Racehorse Summit. The first in 2012 on selected effects of training and racing on the musculoskeletal system, and the most recent one from 2014 on training and bone development in racehorses. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bramlage.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. First, I got to figure out how to advance my slides in the pointer. Okay, so we're moving now from science to maybe interpretation, or possibly from carpet to straw. And the first question we need to ask is it a good thing to be training 2-year-olds? The criticism, interestingly, comes more often from people who are in other aspects of the equine industry than it does people that are uninitiated. The show horse people, and especially some of the disciplines like dressage, have a strong opinion that you should not be training 2-year-olds. They let their horses fully mature before they start training. But I'm going to try to convince you that that's not the case. The first report from the Thoroughbred Safety Committee, whenever we were initiated in 2008, was to the Jockey Club Roundtable in 2009. And our first question was, is there evidence that racing 2-year-olds is a bad thing? So we looked at 3 items. The average lifetime earnings per starter, and as you can see in the red, horses that race at 2 are much more successful than horses that don't make their first start until after 2 years of age. Same thing is true for their career average earnings per start. Horses that are able to race at 2 are much more successful in the amount of money they earn per each start. They are also more successful whenever they're competing in stakes. Now, to some degree, this probably indicates that there are some horses that are better athletes than others. The horses, there are some horses notably that you can throw anything at them in training and they're able to handle it. And then there's some horses that can't breeze twice in a row because I guess weak protoplasm might be the answer. Interestingly enough, subsequent studies, or studies around the same time, from New Zealand, I'm not going to try to make you read that, but I just put red boxes around the conclusions in these papers. In New Zealand, it's better to race 2-year-olds. In Australia, it's better to race 2-year-olds. Even in Poland, it's better to race 2-year-olds. So I'm unaware of any study that shows that not racing as a 2-year-old actually improves the situation. So I think the evidence continues to show that racing 2-year-olds is a good thing for the horse, or at least training it to. You absolutely have to train it to. Thoroughbred racehorse is an amazing running machine. It's been developed by natural selection, multiplied by man. And I'm sorry about the colors here, they don't show up very well, but if you divide a horse into his systems, roughly 40% of the horse is musculotendinous. There's about a fourth of the horse that's skeleton, and then you have about 35% that's viscera. This is an estimate, but it's taken from the dressed weight of an equine carcass, and if you're a hunter, you know that whenever you dress out a deer, or if you dress a cow whenever they're slaughtered, they run about 60 to 65%. So we're taking a little bit of liberty in assessing that, but suffice it to say that 25% is skeleton. These 2 are dead weight. This is what drives the horse. So if you can lower the dead weight in the horse that he has to carry around the racetrack, it's easier for the horse to run. We all know that a principal component a principal component of the effect of Lasix is to reduce the water weight in the horse's colon. The horse urinates out a lot of weight. It's taken out of the circulation. It's then made up for by absorbing water from the colon, so they end up lighter. But the thoroughbred horse is so good at what they do because their skeleton is the minimal amount it takes to get the horse around the racetrack. And so they walk that line as to what's the best skeleton I can have to keep me as fast as I possibly can. Skeleton's interesting. It's refined by the biomechanics the horse sees. The skeleton is actually built. It's modeled from the work that the horse sees. But how does that occur? It occurs by training, and there's some comments I'll have to make in a little bit that I think fit very well with the data that Tim just showed you. Why train 2-year-olds? The 2-year-olds are right at the end of their growth period. During the growth period, the skeleton is replete with the blood supply and the cell population to build bone. It doesn't make any sense to let that totally atrophy until the horse is a 4-year-old, because then you got to build it all back. What you want to do is pick up that support system and convert it from growth to adaptation to training. And that's one of the reasons it's better to train and race a 2-year-old. Now, way back whenever I was going to school, we learned that the skeleton was basically a passive unit in any being, but it couldn't be farther from the truth. The more we know about bone, the more interesting it becomes. It's actually very dynamic. Sorry, wrong button again. It's highly sophisticated and remarkably adaptable to what the skeleton needs to do. There are 2 cell lines, the osteocytic and the osteoblastic. We're not going to talk too much about that today. But this is a cross-section picture of a horse's cannon bone. And you can see where the cannon bone starts and where it ends up after it's trained. So it's pretty amazing at what a horse does to produce a skeleton that's sufficient for his racing. Now, the osteocytes that I learned whenever I was in school is they basically build bone and they kind of get stuck in the middle of the bone. But that's really untrue. They're the directors of everything that happens. And how that happens is each one of these little dots is an osteocyte. It's diagrammatically, it's a cell like that. If you digest away all of the mineral, it's going to look like this. The soft tissue, that's an osteocyte, that's an osteocyte. The key to the horse building bone are the canaliculi and the dendrites. Canaliculi are canals. Dendrites are connections between cells. And if you digest away the mineral, you can see how much of that there is. It's a huge amount of interconnection between the cells. So the weight on the bone is then transferred to, this is one of these circles, corresponds to here. And then you go down to here, and the osteocytes and the dendrites are suspended in fluid within those canaliculi. So the osteocyte is a director. It's not a prisoner. It senses they're actually tethered inside of those canals, and they're communicating with all the other osteocytes in the area. Now, if you remember your physics, the hydraulics, whenever you increase a load on a cylinder full of fluid, it transmits throughout the entire cylinder. That's why hydraulics work on heavy machinery. And so whenever you increase the load on a bone, all of those osteocytes in that general area are going to be sensing that the load is increasing. So how do they respond? They add bone. The osteocytes communicate. In the case of a cannon bone, these will be the ones that the horse started with, these round things. Each one of those looks like that with a blood supply in the middle, all of these cells, and then all of the connections between all the cells. And they're all sensing the hydraulic fluid that's around, which is sensitive to mechanical load. When you bend a bone, like for instance taking the cannon bone, when a horse is fully galloping, the cannon bone bends backwards. The cells within the bone on the front cortex sense that that bone is bending backwards. We have to stiffen the front of the bone. So they're sending the signals to the secondary osteons that are being, to the primary osteons on the surface of the bone that are being produced out here to say, we need more of you. Now, how that's communicated is yet to be elucidated, and if you can figure that out, we can go into business, because whatever chemical it is, or it's probably a cytokine, we're in the age of cytokines now, which are intercellular communication molecules, whatever is telling these osteocytes on the surface to make more bone, there has never been anything discovered to this point that can make a fracture heal faster. Normal fracture healing occurs it's a preferred site at its most active rate. For a while, the theory was electrical, that when you bend a bone, you get different charges on the surface. That washed out. But the hydraulic sensing of the loads in the bone is very important, at least, and how it does it, I'm not really sure. Modeling of bone, I keep my finger on the right button. Modeling of bone occurs in the shafts, which means modeling refers to the fact that you can change the shape. Remodeling refers to what happens on the inside of the bone. And horses are quite different. This is a picture of a human tibia just below your knee, and you can see how porous that is compared to the distal cannon bone of a horse. So this is Wolff's Law. We all learned about that, and anybody that's taken a biology course that includes bone, he's the first person that described that bone is laid down where strength is needed and removed where it's unnecessary. Well, horses carry this to the extreme. They have such a huge cell population and blood supply that they can do that dynamically, and they need to do it dynamically. So how does a horse train? You give him a load that the bone senses is a little more than it can stand, and then he increases the strength of the bone. And so the next training session, you give him another load, and the bone senses that that's a little more than I can stand, so it builds bone. And then all of that situation results in hypertrophy of the bone. This probably, the fact that it's, we used to think it was micro damage or very small fractures we couldn't see, but that's probably not the case. It's probably more correctly termed micro deformity. Now, changing the shape of the bone or changing the composition of the bone, if you just change the shape of this represents changing the composition of the bone, but it's much more effective to change the shape of the bone. The farther you get the outside of the bone from the center of the bone, it's illustrated here, and you probably can't read that, but if you take the same amount of material in a rod and put it in a cylinder, it doubles the bending strength. So the moment of inertia, which indicates that how far the outside of that bone is from the center of the bone, has a lot to do with how stiff the bone is and how well it stands the load. That only makes sense. This is from Dr. Nunemaker's research in the 2002 Milne lecture that he presented at the AAP, and it gives you an example of the blue line is a standard bred yearling. The red line is a standard bred adult. That's how much of the adaptation of moment of inertia that the standard bred makes whenever they're training. Look what a thoroughbred makes. Thoroughbred yearling goes from here, which is actually lighter than the standard bred, which if you look at thoroughbred and standard bred foals, you can tell that because their skeletons are a lot lighter than the thoroughbreds are. But look what happens to the adult thoroughbred. Look how much adaptation, how far that bone is moved from the center of the bone. And that's all adaptation for training. We can see that most readily in two places. The dorsal surface of the cannon bone more than doubles, and the posterior cortex of the tibia more than doubles. Not surprisingly, those are two of our biggest sites of stress fractures in the shafts of the bone. If that adaptation is getting behind, we're going to see the bones start to break down. We're going to see accumulation of damage, and then you get stress fracture and eventually pain. If you have an inadequate amount of repair or an excessive amount of load, the bone's not going to be able to keep up. And so that ends in the kinds, almost every fracture that we see is a stress fracture in origin. Once a horse reaches a made skeleton, which is usually about 4 or 5 races into their career, they don't have to make more skeleton anymore. They don't have to move the moment of inertia out anymore because they've already produced those bones. And our clinical lameness caseload refers to that. There are places they have to keep up, and so the overload repair kind of stagnates. What actually happens is this, in that slowly the skeleton becomes a little bit stronger. That has a lot to do with the mineral content of the bone, and becomes a little bit stiffer as the horse goes. Biologic systems never reach elasticity. The definition of elasticity is the metal in this bridge is going to bend and come back and bend and come back, and as long as it's in the elastic range, there's no permanent damage. But if you get into the plastic range, meaning that each time you bend it, a little bit of anatomic change occurs, then that damage is going to slowly accumulate, and this is why we have to keep an eye on the adult fractures for skeletons for things such as condylar fractures. This is an example of several different horses' shins that we're looking at. You can see the different methods or different stages all of these horses are in. This is from Dr. Stover's work, who's in the audience. Looking at those osteons that are being produced on the surface of the bone, because the mechanics of that bone are telling the bone, I need help. And if they get behind, this is what happens. Stress fractures occur, and whether it's in the tibia or whether it's in the metacarpus, in an axially loaded bone, the shear plane is always at 45 degrees, and that's why the stress fracture occurs like that. And if it keeps happening, you can progress to this amount of damage. It just creeps its way, actually most often reaches the surface of the yearling shin and then propagates up. So the bone stiffness is a little different. If you totally ignore it, this is the possibility of what you're going to have happen. You got to pay attention. Tibial stress fractures, they look exactly like dorsal cortical stress fractures. They also look like the stress fractures on the surface of the metacarpus. They will sometimes be painful in the early stages here, but sometimes we see the actual stress fracture. The better the trainers get at picking things up, the better we are at treating them. In the distal cannon bone, you have to change tactics because you can't make the distal cannon bone bigger. It's part of a joint. So there's no way to increase the moment of inertia in the bottom of a cannon bone. What you have to do is change the structure in order to make it stronger. And that results in the disease we all recognize now as being probably the single most important disease in the horse, and that is the distal cannon bone, subchondral bone inflammation, or bone bruising. It's been called maladaptation, and I don't really think there's anything wrong with the adaptation. I think we just give the horse the load faster than he can maintain. And so this is a horse that I happen to be doing a fetlock arthrodesis on, but every horse that I've opened up the joint, every thoroughbred that's done significant racing, has some version of that bruising in the bottom of the cannon bone. You see it in every racing thoroughbred. So I don't think it's really maladaptation. I think it's just the horse can't keep up. And this is a bone scan, and it shows the hot spots that you see on the bone scan. And now Matthew's going to talk about PET scan. That takes it another level further. In the bone bruising, it can take multiple pads. One is a condylar fracture. That usually happens on the lateral side or occasionally medial, but the distal condyle bruising sometimes results in joint collapse and all these other diseases that we attribute to that problem. So how do we train bone? What's the best way to train bone in order to make it stronger? Well, this is bone behaves about the same in all species. It's remarkably similar anatomically. This is a study that I think is, it's probably the single most interesting study I've read about bone ever. They used turkeys, and they put them in a vise, and they made them flap their wings to get fed. And they are looking to see, comparing the one wing to the other wing to see how many flaps it took to make the bone stronger. Once they got to 36 cycles a day in one day's episode of work, the bone never got any stronger. All the way up to 2,000 cycles, it never got any stronger. And so somewhere in the neighborhood of 36 cycles is the level at which we need to train bone in order to make it stronger. That's an illustration of the fact that bone trains to the level of work, not the amount. The cardiovascular system trains to the amount of work because you need to ramp up the enzyme systems in the muscles. The heart gets stronger. The horse gets a larger number of red blood cells that they store in the spleen. All of that's going on based upon the amount of work that happens. And back when I was at Ohio State, this was in the mid to late 70s, Dr. Fox was one of the people who described interval training. It revolutionized human training. The concept is that if you're a miler, you break your training down into 8 220-yard segments, and you run each of those a little faster than you would in a normal mile, and you eventually adapt to that. The reason it works in people is our limiting system is always our cardiovascular system. When this first got described, there were a lot of people lost money thinking that they were going to buy horses and interval train them, and they were going to take the whole racing industry by storm. What they got was 5-year-old maidens with splints on their hind legs. Horses can't take that amount of training. Their heart and lungs are so good that they just pass the skeleton. The limiting system is always the skeleton in the horse. And so the 36 cycles, if you divide it out, is a little better than a furlong. So the rest of all of the work is microtrauma to the bone. It doesn't do any serious damage most of the time, but the best training episode will have a furlong in it that's a little faster than the rest of the furlongs. And that shows the horse where they're going to go next week when they breeze. And then you got to do the galloping in order to develop the heart and lungs. But it's not actually good. You know, we sort of laud exercise riders that can say the same speed all the way around the track. That's not actually good for the bone, because after 36 cycles, the bone doesn't do anything. It actually accumulates damage. So what about this 2-year-old blip that Tim talked about? Now we're getting into opinion. I'm going to give you what I believe is the explanation for this, right or wrong. Maybe we can discuss it. If you look at a 2-year-old in training schedule, or a horse's training schedule, for the first October to the first of the year, they're learning what a racetrack looks like, how to respond to the rider. They're getting all their lessons as to what it looks like to train. And then somewhere around the first of the year, plus or minus, they start galloping. And they'll be moving a little faster, a little farther and a little farther as they go. Then when you get to the 2 to 3 months before the horse is ready to race, this is a graph of the 2-year-old races in the 3 years that Tim talked about. 2019 is in the green, the pink in the middle is 2020, and the sort of gray is 2021. So you can see we have a few fewer races than 19, but we had less races in 2020 in the era of the pandemic. Part of that problem was nobody knew when the races were going to open up, and all of the races got displaced later in the year. It didn't have as much effect as I thought it would when I looked at the numbers, because they change, but they're significant, but they're not huge. So once we got to racing, the number of races made up the difference. So one of the jobs of the Thoroughbred Safety Committee, Matt actually gives us these charges. So we were looking at 2-year-old fatalities data, which Tim has talked about. If you look at the number of fatalities by year, you can see there's a jump in the fatalities in 2020. The absolute numbers are here. It didn't happen in older horses, as he showed you. If you look at the actual fatalities by month, I don't really know, other than the fact that September was really the year that most racetracks opened up. The Derby was delayed until September. The stakes races are all kind of happening there. So the 2-year-olds are getting the opportunities to race. I don't know why the December spike, but I think it might be the fact that most horses change tracks after Thanksgiving. They go south for the winter. And then the new racing at those tracks starts. And of course, during the Christmas meet, you're going to have the opportunity to have huge crowds. So I think there's some drive in order to get the horses to race there. So if you look at 2-year-old racing opportunities, I took the data as far as 2-year-old races total and 2-year-old race days, and you can see how they differ. If you look at them, you're not going to be able to read this, but I'll just tell you. Somehow you have to normalize the data to the number of races. So I took the highest number, which is always 2019, and that's 1, and then divided the number of races of the rest of the years into that number, and then divided the number of fatalities by that number, which normalizes the rate of fatalities. So that's if you take the same number of races all of the years. This is what you would have. You've got a 25% increase in the number of fatalities in the 2-year-olds, which he's already shown you the blip as to what happened in that middle year. And then in the next year, it goes back down. So what's the deal? Here's if you plot the fatalities by month, looking at the numbers rather than by year, you can see those 2 spikes. And those spikes aren't directly related to the racing opportunities. They have something to do with the training of the horse. So what happened? This is what I think happened. Now we're strongly into opinions here. When you're talking to the trainers during the first half of that year, they're all just galloping their 2-year-olds. There's really no reason to tighten the spring and wind those horses up with breezes when you don't know when they're going to race, because their schedules are all dictated about when they're going to mature and get to a race. So I think they increased the galloping significantly, and then they squeezed the breezes together and maybe a little harder. His work data shows that to some degree. What that does is we've now wound up the engine a much higher level than we've wound up the undercarriage. So the hearts, since heart muscles and lungs train more to the amount of work that they get, not to the level of work that they get. If you're just galloping the same speed, the bone's not making much adaptation here. But if you ask it to adapt in that short a period of time, it's got to make more adaptation in a faster period of time. Plus you compound the problem of the faster breezing schedule with the fact that the hearts and lungs are more mature than the skeleton is, because we didn't breeze those horses on a normal schedule like you do every year. And the fact that the fatality data came back to normal in 2021, I think is an indication that that's a possibility for why whenever we lengthen this space here to where we didn't get the over repair and then breeze them quicker and got them to the races, they were more vulnerable. They could go faster, and the skeleton wasn't as prepared. This has a lot to do also with our day-to-day treating of lamenesses. It's very hard to improve for the skeleton on the healing properties of putting a horse in the field with grass. the reason that I prefer that when we're treating something is you actually want to prevent the horse from training his heart and lungs further, because the skeleton has something to heal up. And if you keep him wound up and just slow him down enough that he can heal his bone problems and then open him up again, the skeleton is more vulnerable. I think that has something to do with the fact that if a horse is ever on the vet's list, his possibility of injury rises. Again, when he goes, possibility of fatality goes back to the racetrack, it stays higher. It has a lot to do with the fact that training is more important than racing because there's more of it. So if you train a horse on artificial surfaces, as Tim just showed us, and then you switch him to dirt, his skeleton is not prepared. Training is work specific. And so you're asking him to race on a skeleton that has been trained on a surface that didn't prepare it. And so just going someplace and race, I think if we could figure out what surface all of those horses were training on, I think the difference that he showed would be even more dramatic. Because when you train only on a very kind surface, and then we all know that dirt is not as kind as artificial surface, and you put the horse on a surface that requires a lot of the skeleton, it's not ready. And so it's real important that we train 2-year-old horses, young horses, immature horses, at a schedule that both trains the heart and lungs, that's the amount of work, and trains the skeleton, which is the level of work. And you have to balance both of those. If you get them out of whack, you run the risk that you're going to overload the skeleton someplace and you're going to have some kind of injury. So I think the pandemic really had an effect because it disturbed this system of gradually sneaking up on a horse's skeleton to where when you get them to 4 or 5 races, then you've got a made skeleton and all you have to do is to maintain it. That's it. I guess we're